there has been a groundswell of people with lived experience on the ground who are saying, I want to protect my family if I have immigrant status, and I want to protect my neighbors if my neighbors are immigrants, right? So this is, so much of it is really birthed out of a groundswell of constituents who said, please do something, protect us. And so that's what the slate of bills tries to do.
Hey there, I'm Jesse Fox Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of the Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. Voices like Georgia State Senator Kim Jackson, who we heard up top. She's one of the leading progressive voices in the Peach State Legislature, where Democrats this session introduced a slate of bills aimed at curbing aggressive immigration enforcement. We talked about those bills, as well as the recent FBI raid that seized Atlanta ballots from the 2020 presidential election, and Jackson's position as a queer person of color in the state legislature. That's coming up. Later in our arts and culture segment, we'll take a look at a Texas dance company that combines ballet with traditional Mexican folklorico. But first, the news roundup. This week, we're going to talk about some alarming signs of right-wing radicalism in Florida and Texas and the ways they overlap. As always, you can find links with more information and sources in the show notes. Let's start in Florida. On March 4th, the Miami Herald published excerpts from a private group chat started by the Miami-Dade County Republican Party for local young conservatives, particularly those enrolled at Florida International University. These weren't just random people. The chat included the county party's secretary, the Turning Point USA chapter president at FIU, and the recruitment chair for the campus college Republicans group. And guess what? Just like the leaked texts from young Republicans across the country that were publicized last year, the Miami chat was chock full of racism, sexism, and anti-Semitism. Herald reporter Claire Heddles counted more than 400 uses of the N-word in the chat on the WhatsApp messaging platform, along with references to women as whores and admiring comments about Adolf Hitler and Nazis. For example, Daniel Gonzalez, the FIU College Republicans recruitment chair at the time, wrote in response to another post, "Ooh, you had colored professors? I refuse to be indoctrinated by the coloreds." Other messages in the group fantasized about gruesome violence against black people and used anti-Jewish slurs. When the Herald contacted Abel Carvajal, the secretary of the County Republican Party and a law student at FIU, he said he wasn't aware of many of the messages in the group, which he started last fall after the murder of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Carvajal said that chat was supposed to be an opportunity for local young conservatives to connect in the wake of Kirk's death. He called some of the messages the Herald brought to his attention, quote, deranged. The County Republican Party chair, Kevin Cooper, who's Jewish, also denounced the post and called for people who had made them to resign any party or organizational positions they hold. He told the New York Times he has begun removal proceedings against Carvajal. Florida International University has said it is conducting a criminal investigation of the chat and its participants. And Florida Republican Senator Rick Scott called the chat logs disgusting and said, quote, "Racists and anti-Semites are not welcome in the Republican Party," unquote. Well, maybe they're not. But maybe the chat reveals more than conservatives want to acknowledge about the environment that right-wing rhetoric has created during the MAGA era. As University of Florida political scientist Sharon Austin told the Miami Herald, it's not hard to connect the young Republicans' rancid bombast to the anti-woke crusades of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and other conservative leaders across the country. Austin said, quote, "With the legislation that's being passed in different states, including here in Florida, and you could argue even with some of the Trump executive orders about race he signed immediately after being sworn into office, I think it's sending a signal that you don't have to hide your racism anymore," unquote. And it's not as if the Miami-Dade chats are an isolated incident. The text messages leaked last fall from young Republican leaders in New York, Vermont, Kansas, Arizona, and other states were similarly rife with racism and anti-Semitism. College student commentator Eli Thompson, who attends an unnamed conservative Baptist college, wrote in a column for USA Today that those leaks sounded like comments he frequently hears on his own campus. He said his peers grew up steeped in online right-wing culture where extremism is rewarded. Thompson wrote, quote, "Before attending my Baptist college, I also saw this at my all-boys high school. Group chats buzzed with memes that started as jokes but ended up shaping worldviews. A classmate might share a post mocking wokeness to get laughs, but over time the line between humor and hate blurred, and suddenly slurs are just part of the vibe. This is the environment that produced the young Republican leaders' chats on Telegram. Those leaders didn't just stumble into extremism, they embraced it as a badge of authenticity." Unquote. And the rhetoric isn't staying confined to private group chats. The Miami Herald expose of the local students' texts mentioned a real-life manifestation of young right-wing radicalism. The Florida gubernatorial campaign of James Fishback, a 31-year-old denizen of the online right. Fishback has cultivated an edgy online persona, making overt references to Mussolini in his campaign ads, which promise to, quote, "make the trains run on time," unquote, and subscribes to the paranoid, racist Great Replacement belief that brown-skinned immigrants are replacing white Americans. This despite the fact that Fishback's own mother is an immigrant from Colombia. He has refused to distance himself from neo-Nazi racist Nick Fuentes. Like Fuentes, he has appeared on Tucker Carlson's online show. Carlson was taken with Fishback and endorsed him in his run for governor. He wrote, quote, "Pretty soon, all winning Republican politicians will talk like this," unquote. Also like Fuentes, Fishback frequently targets Israel for criticism in ways that easily blur the line between objections to the country's government and its policies and anti-Jewish sentiment more broadly. Fishback is not particularly well known or popular among Florida Republicans at large, with the University of North Florida poll showing him drawing just 6% of likely primary voters against the Trump-endorsed candidate Congressman Byron Donalds. But in that same poll, Fishback was the favorite of 32% of respondents ages 18 to 34, 4 times as popular as Donalds in that demographic. Liberal New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg wrote about Fishback's campaign last week, after traveling to Florida to watch him on the campaign trail. The enthusiasm she saw for him among young Floridians who packed his rallies troubled her. Goldberg wrote, quote, "Anyone concerned with the escalating extremism of the young right should be paying attention to his campaign and the enthusiastic crowds it's drawing. More than any political candidate yet, Fishback has managed to bring the paranoid, transgressive, meme-drunk spirit of the right-wing internet into the real world." Unquote. Fishback also offers a hard-edged, moralizing vision of Christianity. Among his proposals is a 50% sin tax on online pornographic performers. He openly calls himself a Christian nationalist, that is, someone who believes the United States should be governed by conservative Christian ideology. He has said, for example, that as governor he would not require county clerks to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. And that's where his strain of online edgelord trolling crosses over with another of the MAGA movement's power streams, conservative, mostly white evangelical Christians. Trump has empowered and catered to evangelicals who make up a sizable portion of his base. Although white evangelicals are only about 15% of the U.S. population, they're about 42% of those who identify as MAGA Republicans. And on the white evangelical right, support for Christian nationalism is growing, and acceptable rhetoric on issues like women's rights and immigration is becoming more extreme. Baptist News Global, a liberal news organization, at least by Baptist standards, had a story last week about William Wolfe. Wolfe is a prominent advocate for pushing the already conservative Southern Baptist Convention even further to the right, into a form of Christian nationalism. Wolfe has a political background. He worked in Washington, D.C. for 10 years, with stints as a congressional staffer and with Heritage Action, the advocacy arm of the right-wing Heritage Foundation, authors of Project 2025. Wolfe also served in the first Trump administration in policy roles at the Pentagon and State Department. In 2024, he moved to Texas and founded a nonprofit called the Center for Baptist Leadership, with the explicit goal of fighting any, quote, liberal drift, within the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant organization in the United States. Wolf is not shy about advocating for an explicitly Christian government. Here he is on the podcast of Christian nationalist Pastor Joel Webbin, a fellow Texan, explaining his vision of what the United States should look like.
The fact that you would have a ruler, a leader, a governing body, the United States Congress and our president, recognize that, the Lord is the one true God, and that it is critical that all of our laws are adopted with standards of biblical righteousness and justice and fairness as applied to our current situation in the United States of America. That can make us a Christian nation with literally let's hope not hundreds, with tens of millions of non-Christians within us. And the fact that our government is doing what it should do in terms of recognizing where its authority is derived from, what the only sustainable principles of justice and morality are, for the keeping of the peace, for the passing of good laws, for doing right, for commending what is right, and for punishing what is wrong. That's not a salvific statement about every single soul that is within their jurisdiction. It is a general statement about the disposition of that government, of that ruler, of that collective magistrate.
Wolf gave a presentation recently to a conservative group called the True Texas Project, which among other things advocates for strong immigration enforcement. In a video from the presentation that was highlighted by the social media account Right Wing Watch, he made a forceful case that a Christian nation has the right to decide who it wants to let in or kick out.
I have 3 boys, and I got a 4th boy on the way, and my boys all look like me. And I want my children to grow up in a country where they're not minorities. I unapologetically, and I'm sorry if this offends anybody here or anybody who listens to this, I am actually not sorry. I want my boys to grow up in a country where they don't look like they're the foreigners here. That's a good and normal and reasonable thing. And there's nothing about my Christian faith that says I can't want that or desire that for myself and for my children.
Elsewhere in the speech, Wolf said, quote, "Immigration enforcement is a just law. So we, as the church, as Christians, should rightfully submit to it, encourage it, and even ask for more. Quite frankly, I wish the deportation numbers were higher than they are. They're not as high as they need to be. We need to see at least 1 million deportations here in 2026, unquote. After Right Wing Watch posted the clip on X.com, Wolf replied in all capital letters, "I apologize for nothing." He added, quote, "What I articulate here is normal, good, and common sense. Everyone feels the same way in their own home countries," unquote. Baptist News columnist Rick Pidcock, who's based in South Carolina, wrote that he was troubled by Wolf's message on several levels. Pidcock's mother and her family are from Lebanon and Syria. Because of the vagaries of genetic combination, he has somewhat darker skin than his lighter-skinned brothers. He recounted his experience in the years after 9/11, being pulled into specialized security lines at airports, and people joking about him being a terrorist. Pidcock wrote, quote, "It would be nice if white conservatives like Wolf, and indeed even my white conservative family members, would recognize this reality of living in an embodied world where those with darker skin are looked down on with suspicion and seen as other. But unfortunately, white conservatives like Wolf seem to be more concerned with experiencing life unsullied by us," unquote. Okay, now we're to my interview with Georgia State Senator Kim Jackson, who's completing her first term in office. She brings a varied and fascinating background to her government service. Jackson was born in West Virginia and grew up in South Carolina, where she attended Furman University and earned a degree in history. She moved to Atlanta in her early 20s and earned a Master of Divinity from the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. She's an Episcopal priest and was the first openly queer person of color to be ordained by the Episcopal Diocese of Atlanta. She's on staff at Church of the Common Ground, an Episcopal ministry in Atlanta that serves the city's homeless population. Her wife, Trina, is a Muslim imam who has worked with the Highlander Research and Education Center in Tennessee. And the two of them also operate a farm in Stone Mountain, Georgia, called Herb and Soul Farm, where they grow produce and raise goats, chickens, ducks, and bees. Jackson represents State Senate District 41, which curls around the northeast corner of the Atlanta metro area. It's a majority-minority district with a population that is nearly 60% black and another nearly 20% Hispanic and Asian. It's also a heavily Democratic district. In her initial run in 2022, Jackson won 82% of the vote to crush her Republican opponent. She's seeking re-election this year. In January, she became the minority whip of the Senate Democratic Caucus, charged with marshaling votes from the chamber's 23 Democratic senators. Collectively, Democrats make up 41% of the Georgia State Senate. Jackson is the first woman to hold a whip position for either party in the chamber. I wanted to talk to her about this year's session of the Georgia Legislature. The Democratic caucus introduced a range of bills on immigration aiming to push back at the Trump administration's mass deportation campaign. We talked about those as well as other legislation that she's either supporting or helping to lead the fight against. And, of course, the recent FBI raid that seized Fulton County's 2020 presidential ballots. So, Seth, let's go to the tape. All right. Senator Kim Jackson, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
I wanted to start out, obviously, the Georgia Legislature has been back in session now for a few weeks. You came back in the midst of a whole barrage of things going on at the national level and the state level. You're obviously part of the minority party there in the legislature. What's the mood of Democrats in Georgia right now, and what's the mood of your colleagues as you came back? Are people feeling overwhelmed? Are they energized? What was the talk as you all came back?
Yeah, I think that my colleagues and I came back ready to fight in a way that we haven't before. Some of us have been more cautious and more reticent to want to, make sure we follow all the rules, dot all the I's, cross all the T's. And I feel like it's been kind of gloves off, ready to fight this year because of what we're seeing on the national level and locally as well. But I'm clear that watching our country kind of disintegrate before us has really made Democrats, I think, across the board, really ready to fight. And also, we've been buoyed by some wins in some special elections. That's given us even more steam to say, the people on the ground are voting for us, they're ready for us, and they're ready for us to come and fight. So we're doing that.
Right. Well, and so one of the first things you did, you had a press conference to introduce this whole package of bills around immigration. And before we talk about some of those bills specifically, I'm curious, just what have you seen? Obviously there's been attention on these big ICE surges in different parts of the country. And of course, in Georgia, there was that big raid on the Hyundai plant last year that got international attention. But what are you seeing and hearing in your district? What are your colleagues reporting back that they're hearing from people?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. One, I want to start by saying I represent an incredibly diverse district. A lot of folks who are in my district are refugees, so they come here with legal status. They're the most well-vetted immigrants that we have in the nation, but they are extraordinarily afraid. So right off the bat, I started hearing from my constituents who are refugees, and then those who have immigrant status, whether that's a temporary protective status, like as Haitians, or if they're Afghans who come here with a special visa. Those folks are all in my district, and the overwhelming response that I'm getting from them is one of fear and grave concern for their ability to stay here. And so that's a lot of our response has been trying to address that, right? And then the other piece that I'll highlight is that, I have colleagues who have ICE facilities being prepared to be stood up in their counties. And so you're seeing my colleagues push back against that to say, hey, we don't want these here. If they're going to be here, we need to make sure that they are monitored, that that there's some responsibility around how we make sure people are treated humanely if they do force their way here. And so it's kind of a two-front issue. One is protecting those who are already here, who are not in detention, and then paying attention to and trying to tend to those who might be detained or who are detained currently.
And what have you seen from the majority party there? I mean, I'm speaking here from Tennessee, where we have a Republican supermajority in the legislature, and they are pushing a very aggressive package of immigration bills, basically trying to work hand in glove with the federal government and increase immigration enforcement at the state level. What are you seeing and hearing from Republicans in Georgia?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we had already done that work. So some of your listeners might be familiar with the story of Laken Riley. There ended up being a federal bill that was passed. Laken Riley was a nursing student at UGA who was heinously murdered by someone who happened to have immigrant status. And so last year, our legislature kind of rammed through a number of those bills. So before the ICE surges, before kind of all this happened, Georgia was already doing that kind of thing. So sanctuary cities have been banned in Georgia for years, making local sheriffs have to cooperate with ICE through 287G plans already existed last year. So honestly, we're not seeing this year a whole slate of bills from Republicans because they already did it. Mm-hmm. And I think also the other piece of it is a lot of them just are kind of putting their heads down because they really don't actually want to be associated with what's happening on the federal level, right? Like they want to try to pretend like this is not real. They're just kind of keeping their heads down. Even when they do, talk about and try to defend the president, it's very lukewarm. They're not stepping out there in the same way that I see some of my other Republican colleagues in other southern states.
Mm-hmm. And so what was the thinking among the Democratic caucus in deciding that, you want to not just kind of resist any further efforts, but also come up with your own package to try to put some more accountability and order in how all of that is being done?
People have asked for it. Our constituents are demanding it. I had students who live in my district who walked out of their classrooms demanding that we do something about ICE, right? Calling for ICE to be unmasked, for no secret police, for there to be safe spaces for people to be able to drop their kids off. There has been a groundswell of people with lived experience on the ground who are saying, I want to protect my family if I have immigrant status, and I want to protect my neighbors if my neighbors are immigrants, right? So this is so much of it is really birthed out of a groundswell of constituents who said, please do something, protect us. And so that's what the slate of bills tries to do.
And can you walk me through what some of those are? I know you. I think you're the lead sponsor on the bill having to do with masking and identifying agents, right?
That's right. So Georgia SB 389 is my bill that requires ICE, when in the course of operations, to take off their masks so that they can be identified. You can see their face. The same standards that we hold for our community police, right? If you were to walk outside, I'm at the Capitol right now. If you walk outside, you'd see the faces of the officers. Same standard. And then also to wear an ID badge, right? So we need to be able to see that you clearly, conspicuously work for the federal government as a federal agent. So that's my bill. 390 is a little, it's adjacent to this issue, but not quite nail on the head. And what it does is it requires the governor's permission if the National Guard is going to be brought in. For folks in Tennessee, this is really relevant for you all because the federal government sent in the National Guard into Memphis without permission, just said, hey, y'all got a problem. We're going to come in and try to solve it without any conversations with the local community about whether or not they want it to be essentially militarized in that way, right? So we have that's SB 390 that's carried by our minority leader. And then SB 391 is a sensitive places bill. So it essentially says, if you are ICE agent and you want to arrest somebody who is at a church, at a daycare, nursery, a school, you have to have a judicial warrant. So it elevates the level of material that's required in order for you to go into those spaces where people expect to really have some safety, right? And that includes hospitals. And then the last bill that we have in this package is 397, which is carried by Senator Josh McLaurin. 391 is carried by Senator Nabila Islam. But 397 is a bill that allows us as citizens, as just regular citizens, to be able to hold civilly liable federal agents who violate our constitutional rights. So like right now, without this bill in Georgia and states all across the nation, and it's very, very difficult to hold civilly liable any federal agent. They essentially have immunity. There's some nuance to that. That's not 100% true, right? But this bill really does create a pathway that says, listen, if you're an agent, you come in, you violate my constitutional right, whether that's my right to free speech, my right to not be illegally searched and seized, right? If you violate my constitutional rights, then I can hold you personally liable and sue you. And so that's what that bill does.
And so what's the status of these bills and what's the outlook of them?
Yeah, unfortunately, those bills are sitting exactly where I dropped them. So they were first read and have not moved at all. Beyond that, we do not anticipate that they will. Unfortunately, my Republican colleagues, were this a different time and a different administration, I feel quite clear that just the logic of if you were going to be operating as a uniformed or ununiformed law enforcement officer, that logic of you got to take a mask off, I feel like that would have been bipartisan in nature, right? In fact, Georgia has a no masking law that dates back all the way to the 1950s because of the Klan. So we have precedent for saying that people have to take off their mask and show their face. But unfortunately, given where we are in terms of the Republicans needing to bend the knee or deciding to bend the knee to the federal government, specifically to Donald Trump, we just can't get any bipartisan traction. And because we're in the minority, we can't make anything move.
And can you even get things up for debate, or are they just kind of sit there until the majority decides they're ready to talk about them?
Yeah, they just kind of sit there and linger. And we do have a few procedural moves, some amendments. We're able to drop amendments on the floor. And so we're able to force some discussion and debate, but we are fairly limited in terms of really being able to have a full discussion. One of the things I'm actually very surprised by is our National Guard bill not getting any traction, because as I told my colleagues when I first introduced the concept, I'm like, we have a Republican governor. Like this is not that hard. They should be more than happy to have their Republican governor have to give consent before the National Guard is brought in. And even that bill, we can't get any traction on.
And where do you feel like, sort of your average Georgian is on these questions? I mean, you talked about people in your district raising concerns, and there's these polls at the national level saying, I've seen a couple of polls that like 2/3 of American adults think that ICE has gone too far, which can mean different things, I suppose. But where do you think the public is?
Yeah, again, because these bills came out of the public groundswell, I'm clear about where the public is around wanting to have some limitations around ICE. I think a call outright for the abolishment of ICE, most Georgians probably aren't there, but they're getting very close to that place for sure. And then I'll also highlight, this has been a Georgia-wide issue, right? So you referenced early on the raid that happened at the plant, the Hyundai plant. That wasn't in Atlanta. That was not in a Democrat's district, actually, right? This has been a rural Georgia issue. I will say there are places where I've seen some movement and where just kind of regular people are really becoming concerned, is that they've had citizens in their community whom they love and trust and believe in who have been deported. And that has raised the spotlight, right? So I think specifically about a young woman who was detained who went to Dalton High School. She went to, little small carpet town. Everybody kind of knows everybody. She went through their high school. She was beloved, incredible. She got stopped for a traffic stop and was detained. And that city went into an uproar because they knew her, they loved her, and said, give her back, right? And so I think the more and more those types of things are happening, the more and more people, just regular people, are saying ICE has gone too far. This is not working.
So beyond those bills, and I know that this is maybe going to be sort of a quick session for you all because it's an election year and there's always this pressure to adjourn so that everybody can get out on the campaign trail. But what are the other major issues that you are either working for or things that alarm you that you all are trying to activate against?
Yeah, so a big topic for us is taxes. So in Tennessee, you all have no income tax, I believe. Georgia does have an income tax, and I'm working hard to try to keep that because our income tax provides almost 50% of our budget. However, Republicans are fighting really hard right now to try to I think they've acknowledged now that they cannot eliminate it outright because the budget gap would be too great, but they are trying to cut it drastically. And really, like, what that is about, the strategy is actually about tying the hands of the next governor. We know in 2026, we will continue to be a battleground state. It is not unlikely that Georgia elects a governor who is from the Democratic Party for the first time in over 20 years. Mm-hmm. And so this legislature, the majority party right now, is trying to pass tax legislation, particularly that ties that governor's hands, that forces us to lower their rates so substantially that the only way for us to make up for that is by, having Tennessee-like sales taxes, right?
Yeah.
So that's something
and maybe Tennessee-like public services too, which that's what suffers when you can't pay for things.
Exactly. Healthcare suffers, ability for your agencies to perform, all of that suffers. And so that's something that we're watching really closely, fighting back against. I just today released my own tax policy that introduces a progressive taxation where it makes the wealthy pay their fair share and alleviates the tax burden for those who make the least. It reduces childhood poverty by 20% by providing a refundable tax credit for children, and for earned income tax credit as well. So we're trying to push back by stopping bad stuff, but also introducing really good stuff to show what's possible. And then the other piece is, affordability is on everybody's mind, Republican or Democrat. They're all talking about affordability. And so what we're on alert for is places where we can work together in a bipartisan way to truly bring about affordability. Newsflash, it's not by cutting income tax. Mm-hmm. And then also putting forth some of our own ideas around affordability. How do we make sure that we prevent corporate landlords from owning every single home that's up for sale? How do we make sure that people can stay in their houses? What can we do about property taxes that really does level it so that people can afford to stay in their homes? Those types of things are some positive things we're working on.
Mm-hmm. Well, to wrap up, I wanted to ask you sort of your thoughts on kind of a big picture question, because I read an interview with you from a couple of years ago where you were or I think the interviewer was asking you about having been the first in various ways in multiple positions, the first person of color or the first queer person and various combinations in both your role as a minister and also in the legislature. And I guess what struck me reading about, obviously that creates a lot of pressure for you, I would think, from kind of a representational standpoint, that's a lot of burden to carry. But the other thing I was thinking is that when we talk about these firsts, it's not that there's anything new, Lord knows, about people of color or people of different orientations in Georgia, in the South. Everybody's always been here. So when we talk about these first, that's really just a matter of the first opportunity for representation, right? So how do you think about that, and to what degree does that kind of weigh on you, I guess?
Yeah, no, thanks. I don't think it weighs on me in a negative way. In some ways it buoys me because being a first, particularly as a Black queer woman, a queer woman who's out in the Senate for several years, I was the only out person in the Senate, Black, white, whatever, male, female. And what it meant was that there were young people who would come to my office, who would call or slide into my DMs, who would talk about how they had hope, how they could dream of a future for themselves that was greater than perhaps where they were. And so that just gives me more hope, right? It gives me much joy to be able to be in that position and just to be a light for folks so that they can dream and imagine for themselves. And then the other piece is I've worked really hard to not be isolated in a bubble. So while I might be the first person who is in the Senate who was out, I stand on the shoulders of Carla Drenner, who was out in the Georgia state legislature, the first one in the Southeast 25 years ago, who was out in a time where people literally would not ride in the elevator with her because they were afraid they'd get gay cooties, right?
Mm-hmm.
So while I might be my own little first in some ways, I look at a longer legacy, right? Like I find inspiration from the Barbara Jordans of the world, the Polly Murrays of the world, the Carlage Renners, so that my scope is just not so myopic as to say, oh, nobody like me has ever done this before. Actually, that's not true. There are people who are like me, who've done it somewhere else in a different way, but they were like me, and I can be inspired by them in the same way that I think I'm now inspiring other people.
Right. If you don't mind, one other quick question, because there was, and I know this isn't directly under your jurisdiction, but there was this other thing that happened in Georgia last month, which was the FBI raided the Fulton County courthouse and took all of the ballots from the 2020 presidential election. What are you all talking about and thinking about that? And I mean, I know that at the moment it's totally unclear what that's going to lead to, if anything. But I guess what are the concerns around that and or strategizing about how to respond if there is any step that comes from the federal government as a result of that?
Yeah, I mean, so certainly the concerns are that the federal government will use this as a reason to take over Fulton County elections, to either call for the state to take over those elections or for the federal government itself to take over elections. So we're on guard against that. I'm really proud of Fulton County commissioners who've really stepped up and fought back. There's lawsuits that are kind of winding their way through the courts right now to try to stop some of this. As I stand, I'm standing in my window and I'm looking out on the Georgia State Capitol, which is now surrounded by a high fence. It's this great, beautiful, welded fence that now surrounds it. And that fence is a direct result of the 2020 election, the big lie. Before that big lie, there was no fence, but because of riots that took place on January 6th and because of really conspiracy theories that have just continued to swarm and round us here in Georgia, we built a huge fence to protect ourselves from people who bought into the big lie. And I'm really deeply saddened to see that hasn't died, right? That in the same way that this fence remains as a monument to the big lie, that they've gone out and gotten ballots now, that there are FBI raids, and they'll just continue to be stuff that continues to be stirred up around this big lie. We know, we counted our votes 3 times in Georgia. We know he lost. And we need to move on in a way that is safe and secure and that allows our counties to continue to run their elections as they have been. I always find it so ironic because a lot of my colleagues who are fighting for this and are standing with Trump around this, they were elected on the same exact ballot.
Right.
I was elected to office on that ballot as well. And so they're not questioning their elections, yet they somehow find themselves questioning his. So these are hard times, but let me tell you, we are resilient people down here. We are fighting back. And so I think that while hurdles and barriers are being raised, I trust that we'll be able to get over them and make sure we carry out a fair and safe election here in Georgia in 2026.
All right. Great. Well, thanks again so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.
Nepantla is a word from the Nahuatl language, spoken by indigenous people from central Mexico up into the southern United States. It refers to a state of being between things. Ballet Nepantla was established in 2017 in New York by Andrea Guajardo and Martin Rodriguez, who each brought grounding in a different dance discipline. Guajardo in classical ballet and Rodriguez in traditional Mexican folklórico. That is the in-between of the name, between cultures, traditions, and geographies. Guajardo is a native of Edinburgh, Texas, at the state's southernmost tip, and she's an alumnus of the Edinburgh Dance Theater's Dance Center there. Ballet Nepantla is the national and international touring and outreach initiative of Edinburgh Dance Theater. More than 80% of its performances are in Texas. That includes several coming up over the next few weeks. The company will perform its work Valentina in 4 Texas cities: San Antonio, Weslaco, Kingsville, and Edinburgh. Valentina is a series of stories told in dance about the strength and resilience of women in revolutionary Mexico. Dancers wear traditional Mexican clothing with choreography that fuses folk dances with ballet. Those performances are between March 20th and March 27th, and you can find the link in the show notes. And that wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit enterprise, and you can find information about supporting us on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. You can also reach out to me directly at jmayshark@theprogressivesouth.org. Thanks to our friends in Bark for our theme music, and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. We'll talk to you soon.